Hello, I'm Manawultus, and today I want to talk about my opinion on Donald Trump. Now, just yesterday, I had gone on a show with Stephen Ignoramus, and we were talking about my new book, A Manifesto for American Conservatives, and I went off on a tangent at some point about my opinion on Trump, and my comments were pretty off the cuff. And in hindsight, I will admit that since it didn't actually have very much to do with the book, it might not have been the most appropriate place to express this. However, it was something that was at the forefront of my mind and something that I thought was important to discuss, perhaps not in that scenario, but I was planning on making a video about this anyway. So I'll take this as an opportunity to express my full opinion on Trump and to hopefully correct some misapprehensions people might have regarding my opinion. So, anyway, there's a few questions that I think are important to answer about Donald Trump. Uh, One is how did he perform as president? And I would say that Donald Trump has probably been the best president of the 21st century of the United States. I think he is perhaps slightly better than Bill Clinton. Certainly not as good as Ronald Reagan. And in my opinion, that still doesn't really compare to people like, let's say, Calvin Coolidge, or if you go back, George Washington. But of course, that would be an unfair comparison to make, or Chester Arthur, or people like that. So anyway, my position on Trump isn't a position of Trump derangement where I would go and think that he's somehow really bad, that he's a fascist or something like that. And that's a position that a lot of people hold, especially on the left. But there's some sort of Republicans that also hold that position. I don't hold that position. I want to make that exceedingly clear. I don't hate Trump. I just think that he's not the best choice out of available choices. Um, and I also don't hold the position, as you may notice, of Trump fanaticism. That is, people that think Trump is the best president. And of course, I can understand why people like Trump really much. If you have a sort of short term view of history, where you only remember the past few decades, because he certainly is the best president the U.S. has had in some time. However, in the broader scale of time, that doesn't really add up to being uh, the better president compared to, let's say, people have mentioned earlier. But so the point is that my position is a bit different from the position of a lot of people, because my position is that Trump is more mediocre, rather than saying that he's terrible or saying that he's great. And I think the problems that I have with Trump aren't really problems that necessarily have to link to his person, but more to things, extraneous things that are going on around him, and political processes that have to do with him, but that don't necessarily are about him. That is to say, my objections to Trump tend to be a bit more philosophical in nature. So, a question that's important to answer is, of course, is Trump conservative? Is he a conservative? And I think the answer to that, to anybody who really looks into the past, for example, I've I'm well read on this topic. I read the Federalist Papers, of course, is one source that I use in my book. Another book is The Conscience of a Conservative by Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is more of a fusionist, so he takes a lot of conservative ways of thought, but he also fuses it with classical liberal ways of thought, and uh, and of course that's a bit more amenable to libertarianism, and it's the main kind of conservative that a lot of people are familiar with today. Even though I personally don't hold to that position, I certainly can appreciate it. Um, but the thing is, under the definition of Barry Goldwater, Trump would not be a conservative. Under the definition of Edmund Burke, the famous British founder of conservative movement, in his letter uh, talking about the French Revolution, where he criticized that and he argued for a more conservative position, that's not conservative. The Federalist Papers, Trump isn't really into that kind of stuff, so he's not a conservative in that sense. If you read my book, philosophically speaking, is Trump a conservative? Does he have a very strong moral religious root that guides his principles? And the answer to that is, well, I certainly think Trump has a conscience, and I think that Trump has a an understanding of morality just like anybody does, and that he doesn't want to hurt the country. He's actively trying to increase the prosperity of the country, and I think that that's something that can be appreciated. Another thing I appreciate is his strong stance against abortion. I don't know if it's softened, but back in 2016, he even, in an interview, he even said that he would be willing to put criminal penalties on the women that are having abortions, which is a step beyond what a lot of pro-life people would go for. And I think that that is a very positive thing about Donald Trump, something that I greatly appreciated when he said it. But the thing is, anybody who's watched Trump a long time, they know Trump doesn't really get into the deeper ethical side of things. I'm not saying that he's actively being unethical. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that Trump is not as solidly rooted as other people that would be considered principled conservatives are. So, for example, if we say one way to analyze whether he is being consistent with his principles is asking how well is he functioning in his religious group. That is to say, Donald Trump is ostensibly a Christian, and the thing is, he doesn't regularly attend church services. And you might say that this it shouldn't be a big deal, and that part of it could be because, of course, there's security issues with having the Secret Service detail on him. But the thing is, Joe Biden, he went to church. Now, I don't know if Joe Biden regularly attends, and I'm sure Trump also, on occasion, chose to gather with fellow believers. But it certainly is a negative point on that, and I think that that's an issue. On the other hand, if you look into it, what denomination is he? And a while back, there were some people on Twitter saying Donald Trump is reformed. He's a Presbyterian. He'll get America to theonomy. And I'm thinking, if you guys think Trump is a theonomist, I don't know. I've got a bridge to sell you somewhere, and it's not going anywhere. But if you actually look at it, Trump has a private chaplain, and his private chaplain is a non-denominational female pastor. And if you know anything about the liberal, conservative, modernist, traditionalist type of debates that occur in denominations, a woman pastor, for many people who are theologically conservative, is considered a sort of red flag. Now, that being said, I very much respect women of faith, and women who share the gospel, and women who edify people around them. So I'm not saying that women can't have theological insights. It's just that if you're asking, is it conservative for a woman to be in an office of ministry, the broader answer you get theologically is no. Now, of course, there are some movements that are more accepting of it. However, the assertion from this reformed person that Trump is reformed certainly would be contradicted by that fact. So, and of course, if you ever hear Trump talking about the Bible or theology, he never gets deep into it, and it's pretty apparent that he is relatively, um, I don't want to say inexperienced, but not very well developed on that side. So, from asking from the perspective, is Trump conservative? Uh, and is he consistent with the principles of his religion? Is he deep into the source of his virtues? The answer is unfortunately no. I'm not saying that Trump doesn't have virtues. I'm not saying that he doesn't have things that he does that are good. All I'm saying is that he doesn't have that religious development that you would expect someone to have who is a principled conservative. Another issue is ideology. What is Trump's ideology? And the answer is he doesn't have one. And in a way, that's a good thing because it means he's not a communist, he's not a socialist, he's not a fascist, he's not any of those things that some people like to accuse him of being. But the disadvantage, of course, is that he doesn't have a systematized theory on how the government should work because he's not a strict constitutionalist. He's not a federalist. He's not a traditional conservative. He's not a foundational conservative. He's not a fusionist. He's not even a classical liberal or a libertarian. His position is more flexible. And while some people see this as an advantage, the problem is that if you're trying to conserve something, you need something to be concrete at the foundation somewhere. And unfortunately, I don't know where that is with Trump. Now, that doesn't mean that Trump isn't capable of leading the country, that he isn't capable of making good policy decisions, because he frequently does. But once again, my concern as somebody who is looking into politics isn't simply asking, can this person do these things in the short term? It's, can we get consistently good leadership over long periods of time? And unfortunately, I don't think that Trump has been able to demonstrate this, especially when you consider that he changed his position on a number of issues relatively rapidly over a short period of time. For example, 2016, 2017, in that period, you could argue that he flip-flopped on practically every issue. And I don't want to have to pull out 100 different examples on that. I'm pretty sure that people who were in on conservative news sources, conservative commentators in that time period are pretty well aware of criticism of Trump during the primary. And I think that that's really an interesting phenomenon where during the Republican primary, a lot of mainstream conservative sources and also more far out conservative sources were considering Trump as not only a challenger to the establishment, but also a challenger to conservatives in the Republican Party. And Trump's victory, in that sense, put a lot of these people in a hard spot. An example would be Glenn Beck. Okay, Glenn Beck, uh, generally considered a conservative. He in the 2016 primary, he was I believe he was backing Ted Cruz, and a lot of conservatives were backing Ted Cruz. He seemed to be the main conservative and Tea Party pick uh, during the primary, as opposed to Jeb Bush or John Kasich, who were considered the more establishment type candidates. And of course, Rand Paul would have been an alternative for Ted Cruz in the primary for that type of politician who's a sort of a fusionist. That is to say, fusion between classical liberalism and conservatism. Uh, and of course, then came Trump, and Trump is neither of these. And this was pointed out by practically everyone at the time. But the thing is, a lot of people, Trump had the right media exposure that he could, in many ways, gain a lot more popular leverage than a lot of other candidates, because he was willing to say things that were more controversial. Now, that being said, his policies were, in my view, a lot more to the left of people like Ted Cruz or Rand Paul. That's what they ended up being, even though the way he presented them, he made them sound more controversial. So I think that that's a weird interplay, and this has been, of course, fed into by the more left wing media that in those past years has gone on to portray Donald Trump as someone who's a lot more hardcore, right wing, hard right, ultra conservative than he actually is. And I think that people that were leaning into that as his supporters, uh, I found it a bit silly, to be honest, and I found it also a bit of hypocrisy when a lot of those people that were initially opposed to Trump because of his uh, lack of conservative credentials ended up switching to him as soon as the primary was over, or some of them even it took them a while more. Now, in my opinion, the for me, 2019 was about the year when I was the closest to being a Trump voter. Um, I the thing is that things it seemed that Trump was becoming more conservative as his presidency uh, was going on, and I think that that is the case. I think that that is true. That is a positive point. The problem is that he never really made it there for me. An example is of how he wasn't very conservative or wasn't very in line with what people had perceived as being the conservative position in 2016 was the repeal and replace idea on Obamacare. Whereas other people were simply saying repeal, full repeal. Trump also said replace. So that put him a bit to the left of the more Tea Party type candidates. Um, so, and of course, people can argue about his character, and I think that character is a legitimate point when it concerns politicians. I think that Trump was careless at times, and that that isn't really something that should be characteristic of the president of the United States. So I understand why people like it, but the thing is, as someone who has a more philosophical look of how would this extrapolate, let's say, over 100 years if we kept electing leaders like this? I don't see it as a positive. So second question here, after is Trump conservative? Is Trump a leftist? Okay, and the reason I'm answering this is because I had asserted uh, a while back, I made a joke saying that Trump is a pinko. He's a pinko commie. And of course, that is not a serious comment. I'm not actually saying that Trump is a socialist. What I am saying is that his policies are a lot more left than one would expect from someone who's ostensibly the opposite of the Democrats, which is why a lot of the Democratic opposition to Trump is a bit weird, because if they had softened up, they could have actually had a sort of bipartisan president on Trump, because as people are saying, Trump is like a '90s Democrat in that sense, and I don't think that Trump is a socialist. However, I think that a lot of his positions lean into a more social democracy type idea, especially when you look into his second term agenda. So, my criticism of Trump uh, is that he simply didn't push back far enough against things like excessive government spending, excessive social programs. He didn't cut enough of the pork compared to what some other candidates seemed to promise and were the more likely to do, in my opinion. That doesn't mean that Trump is a leftist. Now, of course, populism, in my opinion, is a left wing idea. So when he leans into that, it's kind of left wing. But as I said before, Trump isn't really ideologically affiliated. He seems to go based on what he gets as advice and on what he's doing, making deals and things like that. And some people think that's a positive. I think that in the short term, there's certainly some advantages to that. In the long term, it doesn't really allow you to conserve what you're trying to conserve. Uh, Third point here is Trump controlled opposition. And why am I asking this? Well, a while back, I had been on a stream with Bob Doyle, who is also somebody that's interested in political philosophy and things like that. And he spent quite a bit of time trying to convince me that Donald Trump is controlled opposition. And he used the argument of the inner party and the outer party, the cathedral, sort of NRX type arguments, neo reactionary type arguments, saying that Donald Trump is actually just controlled opposition. He's just some guy that the establishment is allowing to come to power because he will embarrass conservatives and and essentially distract from what really needs to be done politically, and that he didn't actually change anything in his presidency, that things were just going as they had been going, and that Donald Trump didn't have any significant accomplishments that really changed the game. Now, my opinion on that is that I disagree. Okay. And why do I think that Donald Trump is not controlled opposition? For one, because he's so heavily villainized. Uh, I think that Donald Trump has been unfairly villainized by a lot of people, that he is really people have really gone way too hard on Trump on things that don't make any sense. People aren't treating Trump with the presumption of innocence that they should, and I think that certainly has gone too far. And another sense on this, another idea on why Trump is not controlled opposition, is that Trump did try to change things, and he made an effort. Now, that being said, did Trump actually manage to significantly change things? Well, Joe Biden is president of the United States now. So, uh, and Joe Biden essentially reversed a lot of the changes Trump made. So ultimately, Trump's legacy has been actively destroyed by Joe Biden. And not just Joe Biden, because, government is a team. Okay. A lot of people place too much emphasis on the president, but government happens as a team. So Congress is there, the Supreme Court is there, and once again, I'm really glad Roe v. Wade got repealed, and I'm really happy about that. Does that mean that it could have only happened because of Trump? I think other Republican presidents could have accomplished the same on that and more, and that's generally my position on that. But that being said, while Trump did have some accomplishments, I don't think that his accomplishments changed the political game significantly. In fact, the trajectory on which we are on uh, has continued. There have been some delays in some areas, some escalations in other areas, but ultimately, the major systemic problems in our political system were not resolved. The swamp, unfortunately, uh, did not end up being drained, uh, which I really had hoped it would be. And that's one of the things that I was hoping Trump would do. Even though, of course, I had my misgivings about that, knowing that Trump is a New York socialite who's involved with a lot of these people that would be considered part of a swamp. So, uh, of course, I didn't have full confidence on that side. And the immigration issue, while there was some progress temporarily, that there wasn't really a major solution. And of course, not all of this is Trump's fault. Let me be very clear. I think that the Democrats did everything they could to stop Trump from accomplishing things. And I think Trump did accomplish a number of useful things, as I had mentioned, the peace deals, Supreme Court appointments, and and of course a wide variety of smaller things involved. But I don't think he really resolved things like the geopolitical rivalries that the U.S. has, the problems with America's electoral system, things like the problem with America's bureaucracy, things like that. So while I don't think that Trump is controlled opposition, I think that in my perspective, as someone who says that Trump isn't conservative enough, Trump in some ways stood in the way, not as an active opponent, but as just a placeholder, preventing people who I would consider who would have done a better job from getting into office, uh, the office of president. That is, I'm certain that there was a lot of help on other levels of government. Although I will say that in 2020 and 2016, sorry, not 2016, 2018, 2018 and 2020 elections, I saw a lot of problems with the way that a lot of candidates were simply arranging themselves on and advertising themselves based on whether they supported Trump or not. Or to be more exact, the Republicans were saying, we support Trump 100%, vote for me because I'm the biggest Trump supporter. But the thing is, as I mentioned before, Trump's position is flexible. So linking yourself to Trump doesn't really say anything about you politically. Um, and also, if I'm electing you to represent me, I need to know that you're the one who's going to be able to do a good job. So while I understand that you're willing to cooperate with the president, and I don't actually have a problem with people cooperating with Trump on good things. And I think that that's a great thing. And I think it's a good thing that happened. But if you're not going to explain your own positions and you're just simply going to copy whatever Trump is doing, that's not only a problem because I don't know what you stand for positively, but also a lot of these people ended up not being very loyal to Trump. And I think that this was a serious problem. So and people clown on Trump nowadays for endorsing people like Dr. Oz. And Dr. Oz isn't the most conservative guy. And if he had endorsed a more conservative candidate, then that candidate would have had a better chance of winning. Uh, and I think would have been more likely to win because of the energization of the political base. But the thing is, a lot of Trump's endorsements are based on the popularity of the candidate, how likely he thinks the candidate is to win without the endorsement, and how much the candidate is willing to agree with Trump and cooperate with Trump. But this ultimately leads to something that's relatively negative in politics, which is an idea of patronage, where people simply put up appearances to impress a superior in order to gain the support of the superior and uh, get into office, which is not really a positive thing in politics. So I think that while there are certainly some good calls Trump made, there are also some bad calls that he made. And having a sort of balanced perspective that Trump does both good and bad things, some of the things he does are really good, some of the things he does aren't really that good, is, in my position, in my opinion, a better perspective to have. So, fourth point, is Trump the only Republican who can win? And the answer is no. So let's roll back the clock to 2016. And as I mentioned, there's a number of different candidates, and Trump was considered to be the candidate that polled the worst against Hillary Clinton, or at least of the ones that were viable to win at the time that the poll was made. And he managed to win, but barely. That is to say that the popular vote swung towards Clinton. Now, of course, there are some people that think that there were shenanigans, and unfortunately, I don't know. There's probably, but it's kind of hard to say until we get that full investigation that I hope we're all hoping will eventually come to really look into whether there had been some abuse in the electoral system. Uh, but that my point is, in 2016, would Trump have been the natural choice for a conservative, knowing nothing of what he would be doing later? The answer is no, obviously not. And I think that this is really a big impetus for my political thought in general. And this is why Trump is so important to me. Because asking the question, how could someone who had a controversial personality, very few conservative credentials, and no past time in office become the winner of the Republican primary? Of course, we know how it happened. A lot of it had to do with media exposure, and that's generally one of the reasons why Obama did well in the 2008 election was media exposure. Um, and that's an unfortunate truth about our political system, is that as it degrades, the media becomes a lot more important in deciding elections, and it's certainly something that I hope we can fix. But generally speaking, my point is, when I say Trump is important for this reason, is because if you think about politics as an art and a science, there are right and wrong choices to be made, because some things are virtuous, some things are not virtuous, some things are orderly, some things are not orderly. And this is a well understood idea. You read this in Machiavelli, uh, in things like The Prince, Discourses on Livy. You can also read this in Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. You can read this in Hobbes, Leviathan. So I'm you can read this in Montesquieu's writings. There's a lot of people throughout history that understand that there are some things that work politically and some things that don't work politically. And knowing this, it means that there is an objectively right and wrong choice in any election. And this might sound a bit weird to populists who think that, oh, it should be the people that decide. But unfortunately for them, reality is not shaped by the opinion that people have. Uh, in the real world, things will happen regardless of how you imagine things should happen. The facts don't care about your feelings. And that's a bit of a harsh truth that I think escapes the mind of many populists. And and therefore you have to ask yourself, how do we get a political system where people are more likely to make the right choices? And the answer isn't to go the full technocrat direction and say we need a body of elites to decide what happens with the country, or to go, let's say, the Moldbuggian way of we need the country to be owned by stockholders who elect a monarch, um, and run the country like a business like that. I don't think that that's necessary. I think it is possible to have a republican system of government that is well organized to allow the right leaders to come to power, to have consistently good quality of leadership. And this is understood by people like Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. And in the Federalist Papers, you can read about how they they talked about how the British system worked and how they were proposing the American system would work, and how many people they thought could work together in a jurisdiction. If you have too few people, then it doesn't work. If you have too many people, the argument they made was, even if every every Athenian had been a Socrates or Plato, I forget which one they made the argument, uh, the country still wouldn't have succeeded. So that is to say, educating everybody to be as smart as possible, and if everybody is the best person they can be, if you have a huge democracy with all these people, that still doesn't lead to an effective political system. So what they did was they chose to limit the number of people in each jurisdiction. So you go to each jurisdiction and it's got somewhere in the tens of thousands of people for each congressional district, and of course each electoral district as well. And those people together each vote and decide for who there is going to represent them. And then they go to a higher body. And of course, if a body becomes too big, then it won't be effective. And that's something that's acknowledged in the Federalist Papers. And that's a problem that the US faced the late 1800s, early 1900s, where they realized that they couldn't expand Congress infinitely, that they would have to essentially make a limit for Congress to remain functional. And that's why we have the current number of congressmen in Congress. Unfortunately, this meant that they also had to sacrifice the size of the lower electoral districts. That is to say, now they've ballooned into hundreds of thousands per district, which, of course, is another way that the system got undermined. And the solution would be to make a system that can adapt and can essentially create more intermediate levels when a system becomes too large to function based on the number of people that there are. Unfortunately, the founding fathers didn't end up designing such a system, and nobody later on made an effort to implement such a system. Another problem is the states changed the way that the Electoral College operated. They chose to have popular votes on the state level, which then decide which party's slate of electors gets accepted by the state government. And then those people in most states are typically expected to vote for the candidate of a party and unanimously, which leads to a situation where there's zero deliberation among the electors, which is one of the original intentions. So, in my opinion, the fact that the name of presidents appears on the ballot is in itself a sign that the American political system has degraded from the design of its founders. Ideally speaking, if the founding fathers had had their way, when you go out and you vote, you have, of course, the name of your representative, the name of various local governmental offices, and of course, instead of the name of a president, you have the name of the names of the electors, because they're the ones that you're actually electing when you vote, but their names don't appear on the ballot. And therefore, what you're essentially doing is you're sacrificing a system that's designed to work on people relying on the better judgment of people that they elect for the task, and you're instead saying the people should do it themselves, which is against the principles of the Federalists. Now, that being said, is Trump the only Republican who can win? The answer is no. There's other Republicans who can win. Now, in the problem is 2020, there was no serious challenger. Nobody in the Republican Party who was more conservative than Trump challenged him. He only had less conservative people challenge him. So in that sense, and these were people that were all pro-choice to some extent. So they were unelectable to me anyway. But nowadays, there's people looking at DeSantis because DeSantis has more experience in government than Donald Trump does. He is in a better position to lead in the long term because he's younger. He has a more consistently established character. He's one of the founding members of the Congressional Freedom Caucus. He has shown that he's willing to push back on a number of issues. And of course, So his preferred policies are generally more conservative than Donald Trump. So the question is, if there is a better option, why pick Trump again over Ron DeSantis, who has everything positive that Trump has plus more? Uh, and of course, you might say, well, Trump does have his negotiating skills and his people skills on that. And I say, fair enough, fair enough. But that's why I argued that Trump would perhaps do better as Secretary of State. And of course, Trump isn't getting any younger. And being the president is very stressful as a job. And look at Ronald Reagan's second term. Ronald Reagan was a great president, but in his second term, he started falling apart. His Alzheimer's was starting to get pretty bad. He was getting dementia, and it's a situation that I don't think Trump has dementia. Let me be very clear. Joe Biden probably has dementia. I don't think Trump does. But the thing is, he's an old man. Let a man rest. Is what I'm thinking, because I can. I'll guarantee you, if Trump makes it into office, 2024, and not, let's say, he doesn't get put in now, in which case he wouldn't be able to run for another term, because that would be his second term if he gets put in now. Which actually, I think that that's a great idea. Get rid of Biden, put Trump into office, let him finish the term, and then he can retire, and then we can get people like DeSantis in. And that's a win-win. Trump gets his second term, although he doesn't get it fully, but at least he can do something with that, and then we get a more actually conservative person into office. But the way it stands now, Trump running in 2024 essentially means that he's pushing out the opportunity for a more conservative candidate to run as a Republican, um, and he's pushing that back by 4 years. And in my opinion, it's already been delayed by 8 years. That is 2016. We had an opportunity. Trump, being the incumbent, 2020 ruined the opportunity there. So that's 8 years where America could have had a more conservative president, that we haven't had a more conservative president. And of course, it goes on. But of course, as I said before, if Trump does end up becoming more conservative, which I hope he does, then I will vote for him. I will consider voting for him. I'll of course have to see if there's any more reports on his health, because people were talking earlier about how he has trouble paying attention at meetings and things like that. I don't know if that's true. Let me be very, very clear. There's a lot of misinformation that allegedly, sources that are allegedly close to Trump are putting out about Trump. And a lot of that is probably fake. There's a lot of fake news out there. That's something I can agree with Trump on. There's a lot of fake news about him. But I think we don't need to have the Republican Party doesn't need to have a center left candidate to win. Now, of course, why the Republican Party anyway? Because the Republican Party is not a conservative party. And that's a point I make in the comments I have at the end of the book. The Republican Party is not a conservative party. It is a party that has a lot of conservatives in it. And I think that that's a great distinction to make. Because what can happen with that situation, because the Republican Party is a big tent party, and that's why people like rhinos exist. These are people that can be Republicans because the Republican Party doesn't actually have standards. So in some ways, either everybody is a rhino or nobody is, because the Republican Party doesn't actually have official ideological standards. It's not an ideological party. It's a big tent party. Uh, but I appreciate that people are pushing back against some of the people like the Lincoln Project, people like Liz Cheney, who want America to be pushed into a less conservative direction. I think Trump has been positive, just not positive enough on that. An improvement, but the improvement that people wanted, but not the improvement that people needed. But anyway, what I'm saying is that because the Republican Party is not a conservative party, conservatives within the Republican Party can be exploited to vote against their interests if they align themselves too strongly with the party line. And I think that this is one of the big criticisms that George Washington makes. It's a criticism that a lot of other politicians, a lot of the founding fathers make about political parties, is that these parties they don't really lead to the best outcomes if you treat it strictly in a partisan sense. So while I appreciate many Republicans and I mostly vote for Republicans, I sometimes don't vote for Republicans if I don't think that they are the superior candidates compared to other candidates. And I understand why some people think that they need to align themselves with the Republican Party to win. But I think that that type of thinking is exactly the type of thinking that is exploited by fake conservatives who want to strengthen the party at the expense of principles, which is one of the biggest issues that I think people should have with the way parties are run. I think there should be a greater degree of subpartisanship and mixed ticket or multiple multiple appointments. Perhaps appointments is the wrong term here. Multiple nominations. That is to say, a candidate should be able to be nominated by multiple parties. And I think that that's something that should happen. And the way that America's political climate has oriented to a two-party system, well, some people think it's the natural state of America. The fact is that historically, other parties, third parties, fourth parties, have been successful to some degrees, and the very two-party type system that we have right now is actually very different from what had been happening throughout the 1800s all the way up to the early 1900s. So something changed, and what I think changed is population growth and the strength of the media fed back into the strength of party establishments. So I don't think that voting on the party line is going to allow you to escape the party establishment because in many ways the Republican Party establishment has been realigning itself towards Trump. Of course, there has been some splits, people like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney moving away, but in many ways, it you see in many cases people just overnight switch their support. Donald Trump is opposed all the way through the primary in 2016, and then he wins the primary, and now immediately people do a full 180, and it's gross, it's disgusting. If you're going to argue against a position, stay with your position. That's my honest opinion. And they do a 180 on that. Or Trump gets elected and they do a 180. Or Trump's up for re-election and they do a 180 because they need to win so desperately that they don't care about their principles. Um, but of course, that's a more broader criticism. And so the answer to these four questions: is Trump a conservative? Is he a leftist? Is he controlled opposition? Is he the only Republican who can win? The answer is no. But what's really behind my line of questioning? And that is the idea of long-term concerns. I'm concerned about the long term. I've the question is, what kind of candidates do we elect? And we want to have a more long-term consistency, because Donald Trump can do a lot of good in the short term, but is his type of politics the type of politics that is good in the long term? And I had already mentioned that I don't think that he solved many of America's more systemic problems. And I'm not talking about critical race theory, systemic racism, that kind of stuff. I'm talking about things like how we run the elections, our tax system, how the bureaucracy works, how American foreign policy works. Because people were saying, well, Trump didn't get any major involvement, but we still had assassinations, we still had bombings without declarations of war in neutral territory with third party victims. That was still happening under Trump. And of course, that's something that, as the commander in chief, he certainly would have discretion over. And the thing is, it's something that he openly endorsed as he was doing it. So, for example, the bombing of Syrian airstrips, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and people might say, well, Soleimani, he's an enemy of America. He's supporting all these different terrorist groups, but he's also, okay, an official military officer in Iran. He's a member of their government, essentially. He's a citizen of that country. And we're going to kill him in Iraq, a country that is not the US, and outside of a war zone, without a declaration of war, and involving third party Iraqi fatalities as well, without a declaration of war, without any agreement. And the thing is, if there had been a declaration of war, I would have said, fair enough. Okay? You know what? I don't like the way American foreign policy is going, the way the term terrorist is used. So, what is a terrorist? Really? What is a terrorist, really? Essentially, the way that terrorist is used by the US government, by the Pentagon, is a terrorist is an enemy of the United States that the United States has decided doesn't get to have the rights of a combatant that the US has by treaty agreed it would grant enemy combatants. Essentially, it means that the US is going to sign a treaty and violate the treaty by simply categorizing the person as a different kind of person. So it can be an organized military that has territorial control and they can be categorized as terrorists. It can be a civilian who is not militarily involved, and that person can be categorized as a terrorist and targeted for assassination. And the problem is, it's not in accordance with reciprocity between countries. So I don't think it's an ethical way to conduct a foreign policy. And of course, Donald Trump didn't start this. It's not his fault that this is the way it is, but he participated in it. And that's a major blow against him. And and of course, that's a criticism I have on Ronald Reagan as well. Although the development of that system wasn't the way it is now since 9/11, that stuff was already beginning to happen back then and even before. But I just want America to conduct an honorable foreign policy. If we want to attack someone, we should declare war. If we want to have friends, we shouldn't be spying on them. We shouldn't be spying on our own people. With because you need due process to determine that it should be a reasonable search, and that's not happening. And did Trump reverse this? No. And I think that's a major problem with Trump. And it's not something that's unique to Trump. It's something that I expect other politicians will also fall into. I don't expect Ron DeSantis, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, or Donald Blankenship, any of those guys, to be able to fix all this or to go beyond all the problems that America is facing. It's just something that's got me tired on that front. And I want America to do better in the long term. I want America to become greater than it's ever been. And I think that that's a positive message from Donald Trump. Make America great again is a very positive message. It's a message that Ronald Reagan was saying. It's a message that he shares with Donald Trump. And that's something that is very good. The problem is that making trade deals in the short term, adjusting the economy in various ways, we aren't quite seeing as much progress on that as I certainly would hope for. And therefore, I am willing to take a risk and see if somebody else can do a better job, especially considering the things I previously mentioned. Now, that being said, should this whole idea on Donald Trump be something that's highly divisive to conservatives? The answer I would say is no. I don't think it should be highly divisive. The question of whether Trump is not conservative enough or whether you're willing to vote strategically for Trump, in my opinion, it shouldn't be divisive. If your conscience says that none of this matters, everything I said doesn't matter, even if you agree with me on everything I said, and I know people that agree with me on most of the things I said who still voted for Trump, okay? And I don't begrudge that. I love these people, I respect these people, and they love me and they respect me. We just have different standards. And you know what? That's fine. We're different people. In a large country where there's different people with different standards, it's okay to have different opinions. And some people might say, well, you're wasting your vote. Well, Donald Trump isn't entitled to my vote. He didn't need my vote in 2016 when he won. Okay. He doesn't need my vote. And that's also not how politics works in the United States. If there's a gap between the parties, if not voting for Trump doesn't mean that the Democrats get a majority, which is how the Electoral College works. The Electoral College requires a majority for a candidate to win. And voting for a third party doesn't mean that the candidate gets a majority. Now, of course, state by state, it's different. And I'd say Florida is a pretty safe state for Trump. So, and I live in Florida. So, I don't think he needs my vote. Okay, that being said, I do vote for a lot of Republican candidates on lower levels. So, just because I chose to vote for a different candidate than Trump in the 2016 election doesn't mean that I don't vote for other Republican candidates, some of whom Trump has endorsed. Now, getting into that, the question of the way I structure my voting, which is I always vote for whoever, in my opinion, is the best candidate on a ballot, regardless of who they are, what party they are, what chance they have of winning. It goes against the idea of strategic voting. And of course, I don't like the idea of strategic voting. And I understand why people do it, and I respect that. And but the thing is, I have this idea that the best candidate should win, and I should support the best candidate, even if that candidate isn't going to be the one that wins. Now, that being said, one thing that could solve this: ranked choice voting. Okay, it could be a big improvement, and I think that genuinely. But I think the biggest thing that you can do for election integrity is to have to get rid of secret ballots and just have publicly available voting records, and that way it'd be practically impossible for someone to commit voter fraud, um, because it would be pretty easy to identify, and people could see if uh, something had changed. They could take a picture of their ballot, they could put it through, and then they could look it online and they could compare the picture and say, oh no, did my vote change? And things like that. I'm not saying that that's necessarily happening, but that's something that could be useful. And some people are afraid that there'd be violence because people would hunt down supporters of politicians they don't like. But you know, that's what the police is for. But anyway, my point is, voting for Trump doesn't not make you conservative, just like not voting for Trump doesn't make you a conservative. There's different types of conservatives, and they have different opinions on how strict they want to be on who they vote for, what they're looking for, whether they want to vote strategically. And I think it's important for people to stop having this fight or flight response, this binary mindset of we need to fight everybody. What you need to do is you need to cooperate with people where you can based on your conscience, and disagree with people in important places. And I think it's important to have disagreements. Disagreements really help get to the issues in society, they help get into the issues politically. So, therefore, let me close. I hope everybody understands that I generally have many positive things to say about Trump. I have some negative things to say about Trump. My opinion on Trump isn't like the opinion of the Trump derangement syndrome people. I don't hate Trump. Uh, some people, whenever they see somebody support or oppose someone, they think it's personal. And the answer is it's not personal. I just want something better. And I think that we have the opportunity, and I'm not alone. We see people like Alex Jones pivoting towards DeSantis. We see people like Ben Shapiro, he's pivoting. And I'm not saying that these people are the paragons of what it means to be a conservative. What I am saying is that it shouldn't be that controversial a point. Just get to the primary and see who wins. Ideally, in my opinion, Trump, maybe he's getting old. What if he decides I'll do Secretary of State, and then he'll be on the board of advisors for a younger president? Because you look at the age of the political candidates. Hillary Clinton, she's old. Okay, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, these are silent generation people. These aren't even boomers. These are older than boomers. And I'm not saying that old people are bad, okay? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that once you get to a certain point, your health starts to deteriorate. And Trump is, he might be missing his golden years. And I can say he'll likely come down with some serious health condition if he makes it into office 2024. He won't be leaving office without some serious health condition, because the presidency really takes it out of a man. And I say this out of a love for Trump. I don't think that that is going to really help him. Now, that being said, if he gets reinstated 2022, 2023, you know what? That's a good thing. Fair enough. I think that's a great thing. I think that's the best compromise outcome. Trump gets reinstated and then somebody else runs 2024. But he's not getting any younger. And that's and of course, as I said before, he's not as conservative as I would want him to be. And he's just, in my opinion, in 2019, he was getting very close to reaching the bar, but he hasn't reached the bar for me. And everybody's got their own bar. Everybody's got their own set of standards. And I think that that's respectable. The problem becomes when we start to eat each other over it. And I think that that's the main factor here, is the toxicity that people have about whether somebody supports or opposes Trump. It shouldn't be something that's a toxicity. It should be something where there's a reasonable, gentle, ironic discussion. Gentlemanly, not gentle, gentlemanly, ironic discussion among people who have a generally common set of principles, who simply disagree on some matter of policy. And I think that that's how it should be. Unfortunately, there are people who don't want to have it that way. There are people who take it personally. There are people who want to magnify every fracture that exists, because you're not going to get me to vote for Trump by browbeating me and calling me all sorts of names because I don't think Trump is conservative enough. Especially when yesterday there was some guy saying, "Oh, do you talk to your liberal friends in academia?" And the thing is, I don't have any of those guys. Okay, I don't think any of those guys would want to spend time around me. I talk mostly to people that are to the right of Trump, many of whom are quite critical of him for being too far to the left. And maybe that's because that's the environment I'm in. Maybe that's why I'm sort of more soured on him than some other people. But you gotta make things work. So I don't make a full decision on who I'm going to vote for until I actually get to the point of a couple weeks before the election. I, of course, plans, I pay attention, but there's a lot to pay attention to. I don't cut myself off. I don't slot myself in from point one to 100 in the race. I make my decision as the election draws near. So Trump, you know what, 2024, he could make it. He could be a good guy. He could be the conservative that I want him to be. The question is he going to make it there? And I don't have a lot of confidence that he will be, especially at his age. People don't change very much at that point in their lives. But I think, you know what, there can be a fair amount of optimism on that. So I hope that whenever people, conservatives or Republicans, overlapping but not the same, talk to each other, they have that brotherly spirit of being fellow Americans, fellow countrymen, okay? Because unlike the Democrats, who are going wacky directions, okay, completely unacceptable, there are generally people who want to see the country prosper, who have good principles, who understand how politics works, and these people can get together and they can talk to each other and they can be friendly and they can respectfully disagree with each other. And that's the political atmosphere that I hope for. Unfortunately, it's not the one that we're getting. So, to people who I may have been rude to at some point, politically speaking, I apologize. Even though I actually can't remember at any point where I really went off on someone. When I've got people guests on my show, I'm generally pretty agreeable. I even when I disagree with them, I try to do it very gently. But I do think it's important to tell the truth about my honest opinion, and it's not comfortable criticizing Trump. It's not a very comfortable thing. The reason it's not comfortable is because there are good things that Trump does, okay? There are good things that Trump does. But people will misinterpret criticism of Trump as a strong opposition or an emotional opposition, which is not what it has to be. Or there's other people that will try to slot you in with people like Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, and people like that who I don't really want to be associated with. Not that I hate them, and I don't. I think that that's something that's different with me from a lot of people. I have a hard time hating people. I don't hate Mitt Romney. I don't hate Liz Cheney. I don't hate Joe Biden. I don't hate Obama. I don't hate those people. Why? Because as a Christian, I'm supposed to love my neighbor. These people are my countrymen, and we're living in the same country. And even though we have some very strong agreements, and I think that there are very many legitimate criticisms against these people. Okay, let me, and I don't support them politically. Okay, 100% clarity. I don't support these people politically. They're still my countrymen. God has made me an American, and of course, as secondary causes, my parents have, but by virtue of being born to my parents. But these people are my fellow countrymen, and it's a shameful thing to hate your fellow countrymen, to say somebody is un-American because they have a bad viewpoint, a bad take politically. And you know what? Their take might be very bad. They might have something that's very destructive. They might be a supporter of abortion, something that's murderous. Okay? I consider it to be murder, 100%. And they're still my countrymen. Okay? Does that mean I don't want them to be punished? Of course I want them to be punished if they commit a murder. But they're my countrymen, so I'm not going to be vitriolic against them as persons. And I hope that this is an attitude that other people share with me, because one of the major things that I'm concerned about is the country falling apart, and it's going to be a hard time keeping the country together, and because of how so angry people are with each other. The world is a mess. People are angry. Donald Trump said it right. People are angry. It's as angry as it gets, and hopefully it doesn't have to be that way. And there's some people that talk about peaceful divorce and the separation of this country. And I write in the book, when I talk about the state, that this is something that the Federalists strongly opposed. They strongly opposed dividing America into multiple countries for very many reasons: strategic reasons, foreign policy, economy, all sorts of different reasons. And I think that they were right. And that whatever division happens in America, one side will conquer the other, as happened when America was actually divided in the Civil War, and as predicted by the Federalists. So Uh, Federalists predicted the outcome of a civil war. Can't you believe it? They talked about the Northern Confederation would conquer the rest, and that's exactly what happened. When they talked about the potential division of the country. So while I don't think they had everything figured out, I think they certainly had a lot of ideas put together. And so therefore I say that I pray for Joe Biden, that he improves, that he does a good job, that he gets better physically, and that if he does not, that he finds peace in perhaps resigning. I pray for Donald Trump, that he becomes better as a politician, that he ends it in good health, that he will prosper, that he will find happiness. I pray for that. I genuinely do. And I think it's so weird that people think that just because you oppose someone politically that you hate them. And you look at that and it's too much. I I'm I'm tired. Not physically, politically. So that's why my next book is going to be about theology, because I'm going to have some big disagreement with some people that have been long dead. Uh, so bigger deal perhaps than anything I could write politically, but something most people will probably not care about. But anyway, thank you all for watching. I look forward to see what you say in the comment section below. I hope I haven't been too rambly when I'm talking. I did end up stretching out some parts, not on purpose, just because I ended up having more to say. But tell me what you think in the comment section below. And if you're interested in my upcoming book, feel free to email me. I'll tell you when it's out. That's something that I'm really trying to get over, because even if you don't agree with my position, and by the way, none of what I said in this video, or at least very few things directly relate to what I wrote in the book. This is more a clarification for what I was talking about yesterday when I went on the tangent about Trump. Uh, if you have questions about the book, if you want to interview me, if you perhaps know somebody that would be interested in talking about the book, I would be happy to hear about it right now. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltos Over and Out.